I'd like to welcome everyone to this event. I'm Dora Costa. I'm the chair of the Economics Department. We are very excited to host this panel on the challenges facing California's next governor. This is the first of several public events that we will be hosting during the academic year. Some of them are still a work in progress. We have listed some of them in our newsletter, which all of you should have received. If you or your firm are interested in sponsoring any of these events, please let me know. Our panel moderator and organizer is Professor Lee Ohanian from the Economics Department. I won't itemize the list of Lee's impressive accomplishments. Suffice it to say that Lee is an eminent scholar. One of his big discoveries was that the cartelization of industry under the New Deal prolonged the Great Depression by about 7 years. Lee also is a public intellectual. His extremely well-written blog posts are a lot of fun to read. Lee takes his economics very seriously and applies its keen analytical insights to the big policy issues of the day. And California, a state we all love, faces many challenges. What policies can counter these challenges? As Lee's academic work shows, not thinking through the economics leads to counterproductive policies. This panel will think through the right policies. So without further ado, I will let Lee take over.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, welcome to Economic Policy Challenges Facing California's Next Governor. We're delighted that you chose to spend your evening with us and learn more about this important topic. And you came to the right place. We have two fantastic panelists here whom I'm going to introduce in a minute. But before I do that, just to put our conversation tonight in context, I'm going to give you a few statistics about California's economy that will be part of our conversation tonight. You know, for lack of a better word, I don't know if we have any therapists or psychiatrists in the audience, but for lack of a better word, the California economy is schizophrenic. On the one hand, California recently became the 5th largest economy in the world, surpassing the UK. And we all know about the remarkable economic success stories of innovative tech firms in Silicon Valley, remarkable media and entertainment talent throughout California. And that really captures a lot of the headlines that portrays California as remarkable economic success, and in many ways it is. But you know, drilling down a bit, California has a number of what I will say really challenging economic issues, and I'll mention just a few of them, and then we'll get our conversation started. You know, everybody talks about the cost of housing in California. And California is 49th in the country in terms of housing affordability. In other words, the only state that's worse in terms of home prices is Hawaii. over half, and it's not just those trying to buy a home, roughly 28% of households can afford the median priced home in California, and those households include multiple earner households, so just 28%. And if you think the high salaries of Silicon Valley and San Francisco make it easier in those locations, it's actually worse. Only 15% of households in the Silicon Valley and San Francisco area can afford the median priced home there. And because of the high cost of housing in California, inflation-adjusted median income in the state is 40th. We are the worst state in terms of individuals living under the poverty rate. Over 30% of Californians live below or close to the poverty rate. We're not doing a great job in terms of preparing our children to live in California. K through 12 education in California is ranked about 45th in the country. This compares to, back in the day, California had the best schools in the country, and in fact, the best schools in the world. In terms of health care, we have about 14 million people on Medicaid. Just taking those individuals alone, you'd have the 5th largest state in the country. Energy and electricity costs are high and also unreliable in terms of brownouts and blackouts. And if you lived through our most recent drought, you know that water is a perpetual problem. The American Society of Civil Engineers graded our infrastructure, including roads, bridges, water conveyance, water storage, and we got a grade of D+. I don't know why they decided to give it a plus, but it's a grade of D+.
Use the easy grader.
Yeah.
That's great information.
We've made so many pension promises that the unfunded component of pensions in the state works out to about $60,000 per household if we're going to fund all those pension promises. And I'm sorry there's not a bar in the back of the room if you think this is all too depressing and you need to have a glass of wine. So these are some of the issues that we're going to focus our conversation around. And with that, I'm going to introduce our panelists, who are both fantastic. Bill Simon is, and you know what, Bill? I just realized I did not bring my my bio sketch of you, so I'm gonna wing it, if that's okay.
Totally. Keep it brief.
Bill co-founded William E. Simon and Sons, which was an investment management company, and is now a partner in.
We merged it.
Merged with Massey Quick, which manages about $4 billion in assets. Bill was the Republican gubernatorial candidate in 2002, coming within about 3 or 4 points of then Governor Gray Davis. Bill is truly a gift for us here at UCLA. Bill gives his time to teach in our economics department and also in the law school. He teaches courses in value investing. And he's such a good teacher that he, I wish he weren't that good, because he makes the rest of us look bad. In fact, Bill was voted by students to give what's called the Last Lecture Award. So students are queried about whom they would like to see give a lecture among all faculty in the university, and Bill did that just last year. So Bill, thank you for those contributions. Bill has also been a major figure within the medical school. He received his bachelor's degree at Williams College, his law degree at BC.
Yep.
Okay. And
good,
yeah, it's not bad. Not bad for winging it. So please join me in welcoming Bill Simon. Okay, our other panelist is Professor Wes Yen. Wes has a joint appointment here in the Anderson Business School and also in the UCLA Policy School. Before coming to UCLA, we were lucky enough to hire Wes. Before that, he worked in President Obama's administration, both in the Council of Economic Advisors and in the Treasury Department. Wes's research focuses on healthcare issues, consumer finance, and when I was reading Wes's bio, one of the things I was really struck by is that during the times when he would meet with the president, he also had the opportunity to shake the paw of Beau, President Obama's Portuguese water dog.
That's right, yes.
So perhaps we'll hear more about that. And you know, it's interesting, when I read that on Wes's bio sketch, I actually Googled pets within the White House. And you know, when people say pets are a great stress reliever, that must be true, because literally every White House has had pet upon pet. The Reagan White House had as many as 8 dogs, so there was, you know, it was a veritable kennel. So with that, let me go ahead and start our conversation with our panelists.
Well, let's give Wes a round.
I'm sorry, let's give Wes a bit. You know, I think we'll lead off. This is going to be a session. This is going to be a discussion about economic policy making. And to make economic policies, a governor has to have productive and cooperative relationships with the state legislature. Bill, you were the gubernatorial candidate in 2002. I know these are issues you've thought about a lot. You know, can you tell us your perspective about governance, and perhaps, you know, where you were in 2002 and maybe how you see how that's changed within the state over the last 15 years?
Well, thank you, Lee. And, you know, Wes, it's a pleasure to be with you. Dora, thank you so much for inviting us. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here this evening. And, you know, I would say in 2002, one statistic is that Democrats outnumbered Republicans by 12 points, 12 percentage points. And as Lee said, I came within, you know, really 4.5. So in Las Vegas, you could say I covered the spread. But as President Bush reminded me, there are no runner-up cups in politics. And since then, the 12 number has increased to 19, meaning there are 19% more Democrats than there are Republicans, and the independent number, you know, has increased. So when Lee asked the question, if someone is fortunate enough to be elected governor, if they're a Republican, they might debate using the word fortunate, because now in the Assembly, there's 80 seats, 55 of which are occupied by Democrats and 25 of which are occupied by Republicans. So figure the Democrats have over 2/3, and that's a special number I'll get to in a minute. And the Senate, it's a similar number. There's fewer. There's 40 instead of 80 total, but 26 are Democrats, 14 are Republicans. So it's changed in that once you get to the magic 2/3 number, whichever party is at that number, you know, can pretty much pass legislation, you know, without the governor, if the governor's in the other party, or without any cooperation from other members of the legislature. And that was not the case in 2002. So Lee asked the question, what's changed? You know, it's become way more democratic, leading me to say that as a conservative Republican, I believe I should be listed on the Endangered Species Act. And so when we say what could, you know, a governor get done? Well, if it's a Democratic governor, obviously the answer is quite a bit. And if you're a Republican governor, the answer is, you know, it's questionable how much you can, you know, really get done. But I want to enunciate a theme that I'm going to put forward in some of the other issues that we're going to talk about, and that is that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And just because, whether it's the Republicans that have the 2/3 or the Democrats, a better policy product is made when there's compromise. And I think we would all agree that in this day and age, you know, there's just not a lot of cooperation, whether it be in California or in Washington or in other places. And so I would say, just to make the main point on that, Lee, is that if we could have more of a sense of discipline, whoever's in power. So Governor Jerry Brown, to me, was very disciplined from a fiscal perspective. You know, he set up a rainy day fund. One of his predecessors, who shall remain nameless, had a huge surplus and spent it on increased compensation for various state employees that some would argue was excessive. But one thing we knew for sure, when it was hard times, which it was several years later, there wasn't enough money in the budget to cover them. So, you know, the idea is, as Lee referenced, you know, California's a bit of a boom and bust economy. So maybe when times are good, you should try to be prudent. That's how I'd answer that question, Lee. You had posed a couple others, but I'm happy to pause there.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. Let's bring you in. You were at the national level in terms of policymaking. Lessons from that for the state of California?
Well, it's a little bit of a wet blanket because I was trying to think of ways I could spend extra money, but well, I'm gonna defer the experience, comments about how the politics has evolved over time to you. I mean, you have much more experience in the political realm. I can speak a little bit about the experience from the federal level and what that means for California. And one of the things that I've seen is that there are obviously a lot of things that we can't do at the federal level. Primarily because of the politics at that level. However, that does open the doors for a lot of opportunities in California. And I'm always reminded of that quote that Justice Brandeis said that states are the laboratories of democracy. And in fact, states do that. And whether states do it alone or with cooperation with the federal government, there's a lot of opportunity for that innovation. Just to give you an example, there's these federal program waiver systems that states can apply for a multitude of waivers to innovate in these large public entitlement programs. And California can avail themselves of it, and they have. And coming back to the politics, I think that there's some misgivings on some from the left, with working with the federal government on those types of waivers. Others see it as an opportunity to work with the Trump administration at the federal level. And I think there can be a lot of bipartisan support for that at the state level in working with the federal government on those types of innovations. And certainly we need them.
Right, right. One issue that strikes me is that there's a sense in which the state really can divide it into two pieces or perhaps more, and you see this a lot in the repeated efforts to try to break California up into smaller states. There was one just very recently, and that's not going to happen, but it does highlight the issue that there are remarkable differences as we go across California. So I wanted to ask you fellas, Wes, I'll stay with you. We see really tremendous economic success, I would say, in what do I call coastal California. So, from the Pacific Ocean, maybe in 30 to 40 miles. And then you go to the Central Valley, where median adjusted incomes are still below where they were 10 or 15 years ago. The average household income in, say, Fresno, California is $47,000 per year, roughly 1/3 of that of what it would be in Silicon Valley. Is California becoming more separated economically between the states and the inland areas? Does that make it more difficult to govern? What does that tell you about what kind of policies we should be thinking about, just broadly speaking?
Yeah, I think it does pose a lot of challenges, and I don't know if it's amplified over time, but certainly those types of differences always create political challenges. How to solve those issues, that's a difficult thing, and I think, Bill, you'd have a lot more to say about that. But in general, my general approach in thinking about this is how can we bring coalitions aboard, and some of that involves really important horse trading. To bring disparate factions aboard a coalition. I'll defer to you on how to build those coalitions.
Well, I agree with you, Wes, 100%. I would say, when I ran, the people around me said that as a Republican, you think about a fish hook. California as a fish hook. Those are your Republican areas. So you start up north and you go right down the center, which includes the Central Valley, the farming areas. And then you kind of get down to the bottom in San Diego and you come up. And when you get to Orange County, you hook in because you don't have any support basically in LA or in San Francisco, which is Lee and Wes referred to as kind of the coastal communities. So one way to look at that is, the knowledge business, if you will, is in the coastal communities, and the traditional agriculture, manufacturing businesses are in the fishhook. So if the Republicans are in the fishhook, and they don't really wield much influence in Sacramento, some of those issues are going to require compromise by, people that don't have to compromise. So that's why you're absolutely right, Wes, that when you build a coalition, like we'll get to some of these other issues, like water would be a very good example. Unless there's going to be compromise, some of the issues where we see danger, such as the numbers that Lee started off with, they're not going to get any better unless there's some kind of compromise.
So let's talk about policies that can address some of the issues that we mentioned earlier. Let's start off with housing. California's 49th on affordability. I looked up earlier today, I looked up the median priced home in Cupertino, which is home to Apple Computer. It's $2.4 million, and it's 1,700 square feet. And when you talk to people who don't live here, they think this is just absolutely nuts. So what are some of your ideas about, it really is a housing affordability crisis in the state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny because I think housing is the one area where economists and people out in the community just have such different worldviews on this. I don't think in any other area more so than housing. So much of the debates around housing and housing advocacy tends to be around like rent control, which is, among economists at least, uniformly regarded as like a terrible policy, for reasons that we can go into. So not only is it a Band-Aid, but it's also a Band-Aid that leads to, only a Band-Aid, but also leads to some disadvantages like down the road. I like to think about housing in terms of like more fundamental like problems, and I think of it as like the 3 S's. One is that we need more supply. The other is if you want to offer support, do it through a subsidy system. And the last S is transportation. I mean, if arithmetic can be an R, then transportation can be an S. And the idea is that if you are successful at building more housing, you get past the NIMBYism, you build more housing, you still have to solve the issue of congestion, which is a fundamental issue with housing policies. If you build a lot more housing, you need to solve with the transportation congestion issue with infrastructure development there, which is in itself a major issue. So, and those two are really just paired together. So I'll just pose those issues right now, and maybe we can chat about it.
I have to agree with you, Wes. I wish you and me, were working on trying to solve some of these issues. I think I came from New Jersey, one of 7 kids. Most of them still live back there. And so as we've gotten older, we've compared notes because we bought houses on different coasts. We bought houses, my sisters, I have 5 sisters. They live in New Jersey and I live out here. And, the housing market has gone crazy, pretty much since we moved here 28 years ago. And it's easily the best investment. I'm in the investment business, and it's easily the best investment I've made, although my wife tells me it's a home, not an investment. And so I've studied it a little bit. I think Wes knows more than I do, probably. I think it's hard to get housing built, so I agree with Wes that supply is one of the S's that is a key issue to address. One of the things I learned on the campaign trail, because I went up and down the state and I was in that fishhook area, is that people in Stockton, actually worked in San Francisco. So teachers, firemen, cops, they were working in San Fran, but they were living in Stockton, which is, easily an hour and a half away, as we say in LA, in the absence of traffic. So I think Wes is right that traffic is, obviously an issue, and something's got to give, because I actually think it's a bubble. I teach, as Lee mentioned, a course in financial panics here and bubbles, and I think real estate is a bubble, and sooner or later, prices have to come down because very few, my wife and I have 4 kids, none of them, no matter what they do, unless they strike oil are going to be able to afford houses.
Right. I mean, earlier we mentioned 26% of households in the state can afford the median price home, which is now about $550,000. Only 15% can afford, of those in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, can afford the median priced house there. And we didn't really talk about the rental market, but roughly 60% of renters in California have a monthly payment that's considered unaffordable. So there's industry standards that compare your monthly income to your monthly rental payment, and about 60% of Californians have rental payments that exceed that ratio. So Wes, both of you mentioned supply issues. So California is 49th in construction rates of new homes. Wes, why don't we have more construction in California? What stands in the way of building more houses? And
yeah, wow. I mean, people attributed some regulations, and not just the regulations, but also regulations used in the wrong way. And so there's a lot of like well-meaning regulations out there. I think a lot of it also is probably just NIMBYism. Everyone sees what's happening with like building the homeless long-term housing, permanent supportive housing that we have funding for, and we choose these sites, and local communities are suing the city. And I think there's just a lot of opposition to change in one's neighborhood. What I find really compelling is, in the governor's debate, is this issue, it's come up, like, is it going to be a top-down approach, or is it going to be like local, control? Well, when you defer to local control, these NIMBYism issues come out. Like, I wonder whether it's going to have to be some sort of top-down, arm twisting.
right.
I don't really know, but I think those local issues and the local politics of it are really important here.
Okay, so that's yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. With this discussion is not so much about the specifics of Cox and Newsom, but the two ideas you mentioned, regulatory impediments to building is what Cox is focused on. I would say Newsom has focused on, maybe indirectly, the issue of not in my backyard and the issue of local governments, local communities making it very difficult to develop property. And so Cox has talked about changing making regulatory reforms. Newsom has talked about trying to incentivize local communities by providing more state funding. Bill, let's bring you in. Yesterday, the San Diego Union Tribune talked about how the average cost of building affordable housing, and this is just building affordable housing, in California is $425,000 per unit. So what San Diego is doing is taking containers, freight containers, and turning those into houses at a cost of about $140,000. Your ideas about the relative importance of, how much is it not in my backyard versus how much is it, hey, California is just an incredibly expensive place to build?
Well, once again, I agree with what, Wes said, those two reasons, the regulations and the NIMBYism. I mean, I know in my experience, in the early 90s, even before the latest boom, we were in the real estate development business, and we bought a parcel of land in Ramona, which is in northern San Diego County, right near Poway. And it was 200 acres. We had it, we thought we were going to try to get 200 houses, so 1 an acre. So it wasn't that congested, or at least so we thought, and it wasn't in the middle of a big city. So we thought there was, and the Board of Supervisors were pretty much all Republican, as is the case in San Diego County. And so we thought, wow, this will be great. And we got voted down. So we had a piece of dirt that went from, I don't want to give you the number, it's embarrassing, but it was many millions of dollars. It went from many millions of dollars, what we paid, to zero, because dirt's only worth what somebody will pay you for it, as I found out the hard way. So I don't think this is a Republican or Democrat issue, to be honest with you, this NIMBYism. NIMBYs are both. They're also independents occasionally. And so I think we probably could do more in regulation. Affordable housing, you know, you probably could, if you made it a priority, like other things, like let's say charter schools and education, or, you know, special economic zones, which my old friend Jack Kemp used to espouse. You know, if you make something a priority, you know, you might be able to get it done. But I think that's what you're going to have to do, because there's so little housing, there's so much demand, and I don't see it changing unless governmental priorities, you know, change.
Yeah. And I want to say one thing to follow up. I completely agree. Oftentimes when we think of NIMBYism, we think of, you know, fairly well-to-do property owners.
Yeah.
But it's also, you know, issues of fears of gentrification in areas that, you know, aren't super high income, that they're worried about and what the trends do. And I think we have to think very carefully about those communities. So, you know, ideally the goal is to build more units. And if you go into an area where the local communities are really against it for reasons of gentrification, I think that's a real concern. And so this really gets at the issue of affordability is really paired with the supply issue. Totally. You can build these units, but will the local communities also can they be a recipient of some of that growth as well? And so earlier, I didn't want to be too blasé about it. The rent control really is, from an economic standpoint, a really terrible idea. But what are we going to replace that with? We have to think very, very carefully about what we can do better. Because rent control is a terrible idea, but really is kind of the Band-Aid to help people along. Can we honestly do a serious subsidy system to allow people to afford market rates? That's the ideal.
Okay, so you mentioned rent control. So we have a proposition, I think it's Proposition 10 on the ballot, that would expand local government's abilities to really expand rent control beyond restrictions that are currently present in Costa-Hawkins. Can you say a little bit more about why, as economists, we always say this is an absolutely awful policy, and why it's an awful policy, and what might some of the consequences be if we do expand rent control in the state for supply, for example, particularly rental supply?
Well, I'm a little shy here because you're the ones winning all the teaching awards. Basically it's, you know, if you're not going to be able to rent out a unit for as much as you can, you know, you were not going to update it, you might even just take it off the market. And, you know, people have said that, especially if this proposition goes through and, you know, landlords and property owners aren't able to increase the rents to market rate after someone leaves, then it's even more of a disincentive to put supply out there. So for the people who are currently living in homes, it can be great, but we're thinking about the long term. We're trying to build an economy here. And when we do that, we want to make sure that there's high quality and a lot of supply out there. And a really great way to do that is to say, well, let's let the market rates, let the rents float. Let the market rates be. And for people who have affordability challenges, we need to do something serious about it so that they can, you know, have a decent living and live in a place close to their community and work.
Right.
That costs money, and we should be willing to do that.
Right. Well, Bill mentioned how many people commute from, say, Stockton to San Francisco, and of the 10 cities with what are called super commuters, which have a commute of at least 3 hours per day, 4 of the 10 cities are in California, and that very much reflects the fact that housing is unaffordable, but people do want to be able to access the type of employment opportunities in areas such as Southern California, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Just an interesting sidebar about the rent control. There's a relatively new study by Rebecca Diamond at Stanford who looked at San Francisco, which put in rent control in some neighborhoods very specifically designed, and not rent control in others. Mm-hmm. And what she found is that between 1994 and 2008, that there was a reduction of 25% in the supply of rental housing. And paradoxically, this certainly helped those who were able to stay in their homes. Exactly. They may have not had the leaking faucet repaired quite as quickly as they liked, and it probably didn't get painted in those 20 years. But what they found was a transfer of wealth from the young to the old, in the sense that those who are in the apartments benefit, but because rental supply contracts, future renters are actually worse off. Yeah. So hopefully that helps you understand a bit more about Proposition 10. Let's move on to healthcare. So we mentioned that there's 14 million people in California on Medicaid.
Mm-hmm.
That in itself would be the 5th largest state in the country, and currently almost 40% of state revenues are being spent on healthcare, including Medicaid. Some who study that issue think that that share may be going up over time. There's obviously a lot of budget pressure from a variety of areas, so getting much larger in terms of how much we spend on Medicaid probably will become unsustainable. So Wes, you've studied healthcare an awful lot. What are some of your ideas about reforms in healthcare for California?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to point out is like we have very different parts of the healthcare system here, right? We have on Medicaid, we have the Obamacare exchanges and also the individual insurance market, and then we have like employer-sponsored insurance. So there's like these different moving parts here. I think that when we think about costs, I think economists like to talk about the P's and Q's. There's the prices and the quantities, and when you multiply them together, you get all the spending. And it turns out that there's a lot of cost growth, and not a lot of it is through the Q's. It's through like inefficient use of services. A lot of it is through the P's, like the prices. And so what California faces, which is really interesting, and some other areas of the country is facing this too, is that the prices in California are really high in some areas. And people attribute that to this hospital and hospital consolidation, hospitals buying up other hospitals, hospitals buying up physician practices, and they can charge high prices, and that's a challenge. So I think an important question in a lot of our discussion of like California healthcare is what do we do about these prices?
There are some who are talking about, and in fact, candidate Newsom has talked at, not so much recently, but he has talked about single payer. Thoughts on single payer? Would that be a good idea for California, in your opinion?
I think that's it's a political challenge, and there is movement towards that. And I think as an issue becomes more and more unmanageable, I think the pendulum swings a little bit more towards finding like big solutions to these big problems. I will say though that when we say like a single payer, we actually don't need a single payer. There's also systems like all payer pricing, which it's basically some regulatory control over how prices can transpire through the market, and that allows some more flexibilities and also has some balance of control, and that can go a long way to mitigating this issue.
Healthcare, as economists, we love markets. We love markets, buyers and sellers get together. Competition among producers drives prices down to the lowest possible price where people can stay in business and consumers benefit. In healthcare, some discussions sort of push us away from markets. You gave a nice discussion of how there could be an integration of that. Bill, let me turn to you. As some healthcare proposals push away from markets, do you think we should be moving away from markets as much as some people say? Do you see market-based solutions for healthcare that we haven't tried, or maybe we haven't tried hard enough?
I think when I look at healthcare, when I got prepared for tonight, and until a couple months ago I chaired the board at Reagan Hospital, so I'm a little bit familiar with their economics. I think Wes put his finger on it in terms of the costs, and I don't think any of us really know what are some of the best ways to reduce them. I think that right now at 40% of the budget or thereabouts, the state budget, the Medicaid portion, that's just not sustainable. And a single payer system, we can debate the numbers, but they're only going to go up. They're not going down. So instead of 40% of the budget, some people say it'd be 60 or 70% of the budget, which would crowd out a lot of other items that are embedded in the state funding system, like for schools. And so I think costs are a huge issue. And so you asked the question about markets, because generally markets will tend to impact costs. So to me, when I was, getting prepared and I read Scott's paper, the economists of which, I'm not an economist, and so I may not explain this as well as Wes, but there's got to be some way to increase competition. And how do you do that? Either, Wes mentioned, there's been mergers which clearly reduce competition. Some of the ideas I've come across, which if I was campaigning, I might, introduce, would be, increasing the scope of activities that nurse practitioners can do and other medical professionals. You don't need a doc for everything. That to me would be, one way to increase competition. And because we've got to figure out a way to reduce the costs, because at the end of the day, that's what's increasing at a greater rate than any of the other fundamental parts of the equation. And we got to figure out a way to get a market in there, Lee, but if you can't, it's almost like you'd have to allow, more competition so that the market could play out.
So to pick up on that, let me bring Wes in. So some have argued that the consumers of healthcare aren't sufficiently incentivized to economize on healthcare, given the way plans are structured. And some have argued very high deductible plans should be available with a substantial expansion of healthcare savings accounts. Yeah. And this will incentivize people to economize on issues such as outpatient spending. Yeah. Your thoughts on that? Good idea? Do you think it'll work?
Yeah, it's an interesting notion that I think could only have come out of an economist's brain. Like,
that's what we're talking about.
That's right, yeah, and therefore it's great. No,
Wes, no wonder I don't understand it.
Well, I think that, especially coming out of the '90s, where healthcare costs really started ticking up, there was this big movement towards consumer-driven health plans, consumer-driven healthcare, high deductible plans, and the whole notion is, I'm going to give you a huge deductible, and now you're going to have the incentive to go find high-value care yourself. Maybe you'll get some tools along the way. The plan will help you. That's largely proven to be a big disaster. And the reason why is, how many of you non-doctors are doctors? Oh, right. Yeah, it's very few. It's very hard for a person going through, the healthcare system, navigating through the system to make these decisions about what's good care and what's bad care. And in fact, a lot of people who are on the lower incomes, they're very financially constrained. So even if there's something important, the evidence shows this very clearly, when they need to get some high value care, they also don't get it. And so it ends up being really bad for long-term health of an individual. And so I think the movement right now is there's a lot more promise in let's allow people to have maybe some cost sharing. You have $5, $10, $15 co-pays for low-income individuals, but then give them a managed care plan where the physicians are helping them, guide their choices in a sensible way. And so that managed care movement has been pretty promising.
Okay, so HMO type expansions?
Yeah, and that's what you see on the exchange right now. So on the Obamacare exchanges, there's a lot more of these types of plans because it saves money.
Yeah. Okay. Let's turn to education, which is somewhat of a distressing topic for all of us living here in California with children, because our schools are ranked about 45th in the country, and at one time back in the 1950s, our schools were ranked first in the country. And on November 6th, there's a very interesting choice. There's two gentlemen who are running for state school superintendent, both from the Democratic Party, both with very, very different ideas, I think, about how to lead our schools. Marshall Tuck is almost a libertarian type school reformer who advocates for merit-based pay, changes in teacher tenure programs. And Tony Thurmond, and these two individuals both received about 36%, 37% of the vote in the June primary. And Tony Thurmond, I would say, would be more a traditional school superintendent. He's supported by the state Democratic Party and teachers unions. So let me, Bill, let me start with you. What should we be doing about education to help our kids get a better, get a better start and have a chance of being able to continue to live in California when they become adults?
For me, it's really one word. It's accountability. And, you can trace that word through, a number of different aspects of the educational system. But one place to start would be teachers. And, I happened to take a look at some materials, again, in preparation for this panel, and I was very heartened to see that teachers are the single most important determinant of, the type of education that a student receives. And now, having embarked on this career with Wes and Lee and Wes started earlier than me, they're way ahead of me. But I really feel fortunate to be in a position where I get to teach. And I think the accountability is lacking. And, in my camp, the Republicans, of course, they blame that, on the teachers union. I don't choose to do that. I never did. I believe, however, that if you made it harder for teachers to get tenure, which Marshall Tuck is in favor, and there was a review system, not unlike we have here at UCLA, where you got to wait. I don't know how long it is because I'm not on tenure track, but it's probably 7, 8 years, right, Dora, something like that. And so you wait for a while to watch them in action. And you look at the teachers' evaluations, which is the only way that I'm teaching, I'll be honest with you, because I don't have a PhD in econ. And I know I'm only as good as my last class of students in terms of evaluations. So, Wes is very kind, but, for me, I want to make sure the kids are learning, because otherwise I'm out of a job. That is not the case in LAUSD or in other school systems. So I think accountability is key. That also goes to the principals. When I was running, there's a professor here that just retired at the business school, Bill Ochi, who was a great expert in education. And he used to say it was so hard to replace principals because they would just move them around. You had to, and he called it the dance of the lemons. And so I just had in my mind this funny dance like the Nutcracker Suite, where the lemons are dancing from school to school. And, it's funny, but it's not funny, right? So there's no accountability really at that level. And so, Lee, for me, at the end of the day, none of us are immune from incentives, right? Even those of us that, none of us are. So if we know we're going to get graded, we're going to pay attention. And that includes teachers, it includes principals, it includes students. And so I think it may sound simplistic. Marshall stands for a lot of other things too, and some have advocated breaking up the larger school districts. I did 16 years ago. And a lot of people advocate blending learning. I think charter schools are a great thing. My wife and I endowed one in Watts, which, it's just a college. It's called College Ready Academy because that's what we focus on, and there's accountability there. So, but at the end of the day, for me, Lee, it all comes back to accountability.
Okay, Wes, let's bring you in.
I'm certainly sympathetic to the desire to gain efficiencies within the current program that we have. I also think about, okay, let's take a step back, and so California is it's got to be the 3rd or 4th richest state per capita, right? And then we're spending, it turns out we're like 25th in terms of how much we're spending per student. But then when you account for the fact that cost of living here is really high, our spending per student falls dramatically. We're actually near the bottom in the country in terms of how much we're actually spending on students. And so it's no surprise that our student-teacher ratios are 51st in the nation. It's the worst. And here's where the two candidates for superintendent are aligned on this, and I think it's really clear. Like the first order thing that we need to do is to, we're so underfunded in California. That's just the truth of it. Yeah.
Let me ask both of you about. We talked a little bit about tenure reform. So in California, tenure often comes for K through 12 teachers. The decision made is made right around month 19. In other states, the decision is made maybe in year 4 or 5. So Bill, it sounds like you're thinking a longer tenure probationary period would be useful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I'd use the word probation because it carries with it the connotation that they're in trouble and, they got to do something to get out of trouble. I think that given how important it is to have good quality teachers, there should be a time period that they, learn how to become, a really good teacher. And honestly, I just can't see how that would take place in 19 months. I mean, I'm in my 9th year in the econ department here, and I'm just starting to feel pretty comfortable. I mean, apart from the nice things that have happened, but honest to God, I feel pretty comfortable. I know where the parking structure is, I know where the men's room is, the things that are going to make me feel comfortable.
I mean, one thing that is, once one gets tenure, right, once these teachers get tenure, I mean, we can also have incentives there. I mean, I think this is what the UC system does is, I don't want to advocate taking away job security about the tenure decision. I feel a little guilty saying that since,
You have tenure.
But
we're not taking it away from you.
Thank you. Yeah. But, so they can build in systems to, reward teachers that continue to do well post-tenure because, once you get tenure,
totally.
The biggest worry actually is like once you get tenure.
You can relax then, right?
Yeah, and that's what we have the time to do this.
Totally. Exactly.
So merit-based pay is a contentious issue in public education.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're talking about something that might be like merit-based pay instead of seniority-based pay.
Yeah, and one thing I've realized is with all the proposals that we're talking about, like calibrating these things in a way that makes sense is important. And I think a big worry politically generally is once you go to a system that has such a calibration, then every year is just about fighting over that dialing. That can be really dangerous. It's best never to even have it. I'm sympathetic to those arguments. From an economic standpoint, it could have some benefits. I think a lot of teachers also really care about their jobs and they don't really need the push. And for some people, it might be helpful.
Right.
But you can also do that in a system where there is job security.
So some of the reforms that we've been talking about, changes in tenure reviews, incentivizing good performance, merit-based pay. A number of economists who work in the area of economic education have studied the potential impacts of these issues. And what they've done is they've looked at, there have been experiments done where students are randomly assigned to different classrooms. And there's some researchers at Stanford and also at Harvard to come up with a very, and the numbers are shocking, that if we were able to, and I think most teachers are doing a very, very good job, but if we were able to remove the bottom 5% of teachers measured in terms of student outcomes on test scores and replace that bottom 5% with what would be an average teacher, lifetime income in a class of 25 would be an increase by about $250,000. So this gives you an idea of how important, how valuable teachers are. And some researchers at Stanford estimated that the type of reforms we're talking about right here were done in California. It would be about $17 trillion in terms of future income that we could generate. So it seems like there's some reforms here that hopefully we will be thinking about seriously in the future. Okay, so this takes us to the topic that, Bill, you've called it the boring topic, but it's only boring when things are working well, and this is what we call infrastructure. So I mentioned earlier the Society of Civil Engineers gives California a grade of D+ for our infrastructure. There's Proposition 6 would repeal the gas tax that's supposed to be fixing our roads. Some say there should, in a $200 billion budget, we should be able to find money to fix the roads no matter what. They never seem to get fixed. So Bill, I know this is a favorite issue for yours, so let me turn it over to you and tell us about infrastructure and what we should be doing.
So before we came out this evening, you know, Wes and Lee and I were downstairs, and Wes made a great point. He said it would have been really terrific if the administration in Washington started off with infrastructure, because it's a bipartisan issue, and he's right. And when I ran in 2002, as a conservative Republican here, I was looking for issues that could be characterized bipartisan in nature. So I picked infrastructure because I thought we could all agree on that. And you know, everybody around me on my team said that's a boring issue. You know, it can go nowhere. And I still kind of stuck it in towards the end, you know, after I would talk about, you know, more dramatic things. But I think still it's every bit as big an issue. So let me give you some numbers. In 2002, all the experts agreed that if you think about three things, roads, water, power, you know, the deferred maintenance is somewhere between 180 billion and 250 billion. That was in 2002. Now, they all pretty much agree it's between, you know, 300 and 450 billion. And that's a huge number. You know, in a bad deficit year, you got about a 30 or 40 billion dollar deficit in California, so it's basically 10 times that. So to me, you know, that was something really worthy to talk about. And you know, in an attempt to, you know, dress it up a little bit, I use this analogy. Think of a house of California. In 2002, California had 36 million people. Today, we're about to hit 40 million. And it's a little bit like your house hasn't been repainted in 25 years. The paint's peeling, the plumbing's on the fritz, and everybody agrees with it. You know, if you look at the roads, you know, some of the worst roads in the country, you know, the engineers gave us a D+. I think that they're easy graders. I think that you know, the Reason Foundation would give us an F on roads. And if you look at the intersections, you know, the one that we think about when we go watch the Dodgers, right? When you go down the 10 from here, and you get to the 101 and the 110 interchange, that's one of the worst intersections in the country. Was in 2002, is today. If you look at electricity, you know, the reason that I got close to Davis in 2002 was because we had a blackout. In the beginning, he was very unpopular, so no Republicans wanted to run against him. I was willing to run against him. There was a blackout. Then the mayor of LA, who shall remain nameless, but if you guessed Dick Reardon, you'd be correct. he jumped in. And so we battled it out in the primary. But we haven't had a huge blackout since then, but we've had rolling blackouts, right? So our problem is the grid. That's the big problem. There's lots of other problems. There's retail pricing for electricity and what have you. But the overall problem is we get too many people in the House of California, you know, kind of living on a grid that breaks down. I mean, and then water, you know, Lee mentioned a statistic before we came out here, that the average age of a pipe in LA, which I'd never heard, I thought it was just like the House of California, is 85 years or thereabouts. And the useful life of a pipe is about 50. So why are we surprised when polypropylene gets refurbished and the next thing you know, it's flooded? I mean, it's like, wow. So to me, you know, there's some answers that would make sense. It's a great bipartisan issue, as I mentioned. I think there's ways to do it off budget, you know, whether it be public-private partnerships, which got approved under Schwarzenegger, but you know, they're a demon to Democrats, and I don't understand completely. I never really did, but that's a case where if we could get a little bipartisanship working, you know, you could structure it. Other states have done it, where companies can make money by constructing a road, a water, or power, and the government can own it. It could be like a utility. And then finally, water. I'm going to say something. It's really been enjoyable to be on this panel. I've hardly said anything terribly controversial, but now I'm going to say something controversial. Water experts will say we have a drought every 12 years. But They also will say 80% of precipitation goes into the Pacific Ocean. So whether that number is 80% or 70% or 60%, we really don't have a drought. I'm not going to be popular for saying that. We don't have a statewide drought. We've got area droughts. We've got droughts in the Central Valley because we shipped all the water to LA, you know, like in that movie in the 20s with Jack Nicholson.
Chinatown.
Chinatown. And, you know, I went up north as a young buck campaigning, not knowing what I was doing, and I almost got my head taken off by people that said, all you know about water is whether your swimming pool in LA is full. And I said to myself, you know, next time I'm going to be a little more street smart. And so, you know, if we could, and once again I go back to this theme of bipartisanship, there are places in the state where you could have above ground storage. I'm not talking about the Auburn Dam or some of the shibboleths, some of the third rails of historic California politics. There are plenty of places where you could put above ground storage. It's environmentally sensitive. And so to me, you know, you had asked a question about water and the infrastructure, Lee, and I think you could have a water market. You know, economists like us, although I'm a faux economist, but the real ones, Wes and Lee, would say water markets could work, you know, because it would smooth out the pricing, you know, inefficiencies. I don't even think you need to go there, just like I don't think we really have a drought. And, you know, I think if we trap the water, you know, you could smooth out the times when the precipitation wasn't as high. It's not a drought every 12 years. The precipitation, you know, it's just like boom and bust in tax revenues. It goes up and down. So when it's down, you got to have water in storage facilities. So that's infrastructure.
Okay.
Sorry to be long-winded.
No, not at all. Not at all. Wes, markers for water?
Well, I mean, generally, I agree with everything you said. I think it's both a bipartisan issue and it's of the utmost importance. I happen to not think it's boring, but that's why I'm an economist. You know, I do think that when we think about like water markets, you know, one of the, where you said that there's the left seems to be resistant to some of these like public-private partnerships. My understanding is that there isn't so much a resistance against the partnerships and who builds the thing. It's who owns it afterwards. Whether
basically
you can charge a toll, right? Or you can
totally.
Yeah,
I agree.
That type of thing.
I agree with you. That's why I said at the end.
Yeah.
Let the government own it.
Yeah.
Like a utility.
And I think in that case, I think there might be a lot of bipartisan support.
Totally.
Like when Trump first came out with his ideas about infrastructure, I think a lot of the left was resistant to that because I think the idea was to have public-private partnerships on the ownership side afterwards, and things that would have been built by the private companies and owned by the private companies anyways. And so the question of you know, who owns those water rights later and how they can like allocate that. Yeah, again, it's one of these things where it has to be calibrated really well to make sure that, you know, there's a lot of equity in there.
So I'll just follow up just with one postscript. Agriculture and environmental use takes up about 80% of state water, and I don't mean that pejoratively. That's just a fact. So all non-agricultural business and households use just 20% of state water. You know, one issue that a water market would solve would be these issues about water rights. So right now, agricultural users who produce incredibly thirsty crops like alfalfa and rice, they get a water allocation, and it's really use it or lose it, instead of saying, let's sell it. So, you know, what as an economist, what really bugged me is that in the worst drought in 1,200 years, we were producing alfalfa, which is one of the lowest value crops, which is one of the most water intensive crops, and then exporting most of that to China. So we were exporting water to China during the most severe drought we've ever had. So those are the things that just drive me up the, anyway, not meaning to vent here.
I concur.
Let me, okay, before we turn it over to the Q&A session, let me ask a little bit of a controversial question to both of you, whoever wants to lead off. Why why aren't things getting done? Why do we still have 90-year-old water pipes and dams that break? and it's been estimated that our cars suffer $2,500 additional depreciation and maintenance per year because of bad roads. So what about policy making in California leads us to not have these first order issues, really ever dealt with? What is it about budgets or preferences of politicians? Ideas about that? Why can't we get more stuff done on these issues?
I mean, if you go back to the days of when Pat Brown was governor, great Democratic governor, I think about 20% of the budget was spent on infrastructure. Now those were the days when they were building freeways, so it was an extraordinary time. That is correct. But now I think we're down to like 1 or 2%.
2%.
And somehow that's got to change. And if you look at how the various slices of the budget pie have changed over the years, it's going to have to come from someplace else, clearly. And so it's got to be somebody that has the political will. A Democratic governor like Gavin Newsom could probably, bump that to 4 or 5%, because he would have, politically, I think he'd be able to get it done. Schwarzenegger was not able to get it done, even during his honeymoon period. So when Schwarzenegger got elected in the recall, he had a honeymoon period of about 2 or 3 years before he put the 5 initiatives on the ballot, and that was the end. And you remember that. And so during that period, he tried to set up these public-private partnerships, but they just never went anywhere. So I wish I could be more optimistic.
Wes?
I can beat you on the pessimism here. I think that the budget's the problem.
Yeah.
So I think of it this way. We've all heard how the U.S. issues of inequality has just risen so much. Whatever that trend is nationally, California is worse. And so if you think from 1979 to like 2013, the bottom 95%, if you imagine the real incomes have grown 0, whereas the top 1%, it's basically doubled. And I'm talking the amounts are very different too. Like in 1979, in real incomes, the bottom 95% is earning just about $50,000 a year in real terms today. The top 1% on average was earning about $850,000. So that's what it was in 1979. Now the bottom 95% earns $50,000, and the top 1% earns $1.6 million. And so the budget hasn't grown. There's the productivity gains that we have in society really aren't being shared. And so we can, alter it on the regulations to ensure that wages are growing, in proportion to productivity. We can do it on the back end. Let's just squeeze the workers, but then let's tax more. We got to do something here. We cannot sustain this because, as you said, our infrastructure is falling apart. We're growing as a country, and the money just isn't there to help fix the country.
And I think in terms of budget shares, you're probably, in the audience, probably thinking, well, we used to spend 20% on capital projects, now we spend 2%, so what has changed in the budget? And the big change has been in healthcare. Health expenditures at the state level have about doubled between the 1960s and today, from about 18% to about 38%. So, yeah, there's a lot of demands on the budget.
A lot of demands, yeah.
Okay, well, let me, we've been talking for a while. We'd like to turn it over to you if you'd like to ask some questions. There's a mic in the middle aisle. And my one request would be just please keep your questions very short, and we will have our experts here answer your questions. So if you want to give me a raise of a hand, and then we'll send you out. Yes, sir.
It's kind of to the last point. It appears that Democrats are in control and so forth. So all the discussion about solutions can be on the left, on the Democratic. So if it could convince the population politically that infrastructure and so on is a redistribution to the poor. If you could say roads are for the poor, etc., education is to the poor. We could take away money, perhaps not from healthcare, but perhaps from public sector unions, which has not been mentioned, which is also on the left. Say to the people on the left, look, this is money that's going to a section of the left, then perhaps it could be fought out on the left as a solution.
Yeah, I think, this gets at a point that you raised very, very early on when we first met. It's like, what's going on with our governance in general? Like, is the common person being represented, basically? So we have this great scholar who joined our department, Marty Gillens, who has this study that says, as the support for a policy among average voters goes up, what are the chances that thing gets passed? And it doesn't affect the chances something gets passed at all. And basically, if you look at economic elites and interest groups, the more they support it, the higher the probability something gets passed. So there's something very deeply misaligned here when it comes to like political representation. So it turns out that I think that if you develop infrastructure, it doesn't just help the poor, it helps everybody. We're very closely verging on a society, I think, where these economic elites who have political influence, they simply can live outside the world of the roads that we live on. And I think that's a very dangerous place that we are veering towards.
Yes, ma'am.
Are there efforts to move businesses into the cities in the Central Valley, Bakersfield, Fresno, the major cities, and make it an effort to move population centers away, or at least split them? I mean, the coast is wonderful, but it's full up.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question, and we didn't get a chance to talk about trying to revitalize inland areas, including the Central Valley. And we have a number of universities and state colleges out there where we could do development and perhaps do development very, very productively. Your thoughts, fellas?
Well, I mentioned, this notion of a special economic zone. I'm sure Wes and Lee know about it better than I do, but they've tried them in various places and they just haven't worked. So
the new university up there is full up.
You mean Merced?
You bet.
Yeah.
It's full up. They don't have enough housing, it's booming. And it
Yeah.
shows, I think, that people kind of aren't afraid.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's true from an educational perspective, but when you talk about actually businesses going in, I think that it would make a lot of sense if you could incent them. Yeah. You could give them tax incentives, which is what they do in special economic zones. And, we looked into special economic zones in East LA, which, was desperately in need of economic revitalization. And on paper, it makes a lot of sense. But then you got to get the businesses to do it.
Yeah.
10,000 businesses have left California, estimated, since about 2006. And Los Angeles, in the 25-year period between 1989 and 2014, Los Angeles had the worst record of job creation of any major city in the country, worse than Detroit, worse than Cleveland, worse than St. Louis. Los Angeles actually lost jobs in that 25-year period, believe it or not. Yes, sir, we have standing at the microphone.
Yes, I had two questions. The first is, I'm a native Californian born here. I think the single worst political impact of the past generation was term limits, because it lobotomized the legislature. The administrative departments now have nobody to worry about, whereas for most of my life, the committee chairman in the Senate and the Assembly, regardless of party, knew what their departments were doing. So there's almost no oversight by the legislature now, and by the time somebody figures out what's going on, he runs for another office, and the incumbents don't care. They pass a bill because it sounds good, and somebody else will be there when it takes effect and it doesn't work. The other problem, besides I think term limits has helped with, but having a supermajority is it allows the supermajority to pass regressive taxes because they don't have to worry about the other guys pointing it out. I think the problem with the gas tax right now, which may or may not be repealed, is that an awful lot of middle income and working class people, especially Latinos, think that tax was aimed right at them. It was the yuppies in Frisco socking it to the guy with the pickup truck. The last time it happened, it was overwhelmingly repealed. I don't know what's going to happen this time, but you know, there are minor things that I think have made a huge difference, and term limits, I think, was catastrophic. Thank you.
Okay. Legislators being termed out.
You know, it's almost like the pendulum swung too far in the other direction. So when there were no term limits, you know, the argument was you just had the same old, right? People weren't doing their job. They were getting reelected. You know, they could live off the fat of the land. So term limits were put in. And I think the argument is, and I agree with it, what you said, is that the term limits were too short. So if you lengthened them, which I think would be a good idea, maybe you'd have the best of both worlds. You know, maybe the truth is in the middle somewhere. And because the disadvantages of the old system, you know, were pretty clear. It was just cronyism, you know, in the 80s and 90s, right? And now you've got people in the legislature for 2 or 3 years, they're Speaker of the House. And what do they know? They don't have a lot. It's like the teacher getting tenure after 19 months.
None of them are Willie Brown.
Pardon me?
None of these people are Willie Brown.
Yeah, well, Willie Brown wasn't Willie Brown after 19 months, you know, so, and even old Willie. So I think that there's something in the middle there that might work nicely.
I wanted to talk about education. I taught in the public schools for 40 years, and I don't know how you can compare teaching at a UC with a public school. Los Angeles, the kids now are 80% are in poverty. So how do you teach a kid with those kind of the issues that our kids come to school with?
Well, my wife and I endowed a school in Watts, about 100 yards from Watts Tower, and we've got 500 kids in high school, and I'm down there usually a couple of days a month, and you know, it's a challenge. You know better than I do, having done it for 40 years. I've been only doing it for about 10 years, and but it's like that's when you talk about how important teachers are, how important, you know, kind of the extras, you know, whether it be tutoring for tests, you know, that they have to take to get into college, or, you know, other forms of tutoring, or getting to know the parents. I mean, it's really hand-to-hand, you know, not combat, but, you know, that's what we found. You know, our 9th graders are reading at a 3rd grade level in the beginning of 9th grade. Can you imagine? I mean, you probably face that, but how do you get them up to a proper reading level so they can take a college board? That's a big challenge. Pardon me?
Yeah, well,
No, they don't. But, you know, they can go to vocational education, or they can go to community college. But you got to help them, you know, get to the next step.
Please, yes.
No, I was just going to say again that, you know, many of these supports that you're suggesting, which are really great and probably very beneficial to students, that's time of an educator, and that we're just so grossly underfunded. I tried to be polite about it earlier, but
No.
I mean, the 2 candidates who are, you know, apparently at diametrically opposite views on, you know, charter schools, however, they're completely aligned on this basic fact, is that we're just so underfunded. Now, how do we create the incentives for how best to use those funds if it were ever to increase? I think that's an important question. And related to all of this is, you know, the stresses at home, where there isn't the at-home support. And, you know, obviously, I don't have any solutions for that, but I do know that the types of economic pressures that families face is very difficult. And so, again, one of the legs of the pillars of everything is wage growth. And we simply don't have that. And that really is a fundamental thing in everything that we've talked about today.
You know, Wes, you know, this may be, you know, I'm being too long-winded, but in this charter school that my wife and I endowed, it's part of a network of 28 charter schools. And we've tried so hard, whether it's to get them into, help them get into community college or vocational education or college. And we now are at, you know, 95%. But the dirty little secret, which, you know, Wes referred to, is that 40% of them don't attend the first day of class as freshmen. They call it summer melt. And the reason is because they have economic pressures. They got to spend $200 for books. They got to, you know, get up to the campus, you know, whatever it is. And sometimes their parents are like, we need you around the house to work. So there's another issue. So to go back to your question, I'm sorry I didn't get your name. You know, it's a challenge. You know, literally from the day they enroll in school, in high school, to the day they enroll in college, and then it continues. There's foundations. The Posse Foundation, you know, has shadows that go with them through college. So it's, you know, you're right, Wes, it's incredibly expensive, and we don't spend enough, you know, we don't recognize some of these other issues.
Let's, we have a lot of questions. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to limit it to maybe two more. You've had your hand up quite a long time here.
This department, the economics department, gave a wonderful lecture last spring of technology and how it's going to affect everything. And that's one of the things we haven't covered tonight. But it's possible that the huge health of medical care may be brought down due to the technology coming in, where there can be almost doctorless surgeries, I mean, or diagnosis and things like that that sound very far out. But when you think where we were 25 or 30 years ago about technology with the old typewriters, and then you think of how we're all walking around with these little handheld devices called phones that have more power in them than the computers, the landing, the rocket, and the spaceship on the moon. I think so much is going to change that the way we're looking at things tonight will go out, will go down the drain, because we'll have to look at it a very different way. My big fear is that the people won't have jobs because the technology will take over so much of this. And then what we're going to have to do is to find ways to meaningfully employ them and pay for them. That's what I think is going to be the big challenge. And I would think that our next governor coming in, if he could set up some wonderful studies on this of how California can be the leader in the nation, if not the world, on taking the technology and adapting it, because we have the basics here. We have about the finest technology companies and the biggest right here in the state. So that would be one of the things I'd love to see UCLA push and get behind.
Well, technology has completely transformed our lives just in the last, really almost transforms our lives every 10 years now, as opposed to maybe 30 or 40 years. And I think the importance of really having a highly performing school system is fundamental if young people are going to have the skills available to transition from job to job, where perhaps those jobs are going to be more efficiently performed by capital goods such as robots or highly technical equipment. So yes, that's a very good point. There was one question. You know, I'm bad at doing this. Let me come. This person in the back, yes, you're right here. I know you've had your hand up quite a long time. If you're really quick, we'll get that one in, and we'll get this gentleman here in the third row.
So my question is also in response to a conversation about education.
Could I trouble you to go to the mic? So I'm not sure other people can hear.
I think she's a student.
Hello.
Yes,
So
perfect.
my question is also in response to our conversation about education. And there's been some talk about issues of accountability and how we can really make our teachers sort of the best that they can be, considering that, we've mentioned this idea that teachers are really the sort of linchpin behind student success and ultimately contributing to this larger, sort of landscape of economic wealth and success, et cetera. And my question is, how can we sort of take a step back and consider how, beyond making the teachers that we currently have more accountable and more successful, how do we get who are these people that we're holding accountable, right? When we talk about issues like wage growth or incentivizing our citizens to perform a certain way or to behave a certain way, I see that there is a significant wage gap with the education, the community of educators and other industries that we seem to prioritize economically, at least, right? There's this cultural narrative that teachers are martyrs and that they're doing this job that's really important and they're sacrificing so much. But instead of building this narrative, the cultural narrative of martyrdom, why not make them not martyrs? Why not attract more competitive candidates to begin with so we can have the best and the brightest teaching to begin with? And when we get the better and brighter candidates, how can we keep them? Because I'm reluctant to say this is a statistic, but perhaps an anecdotal data point is that teachers often, like the best teachers often, the hardest working teachers, often burn out within the first 5 to 7 years of teaching, often fewer years. And, and I find this to be very concerning as well. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Wes?
Yeah, and so I completely agree. And I think maybe I've been speaking too obliquely, but that's precisely what I would do. I mean, I've been stressing this underfunding, and the question is how we use additional funds if we were ever to have that for our K through 12 education system. And for example, if we have like the 5% worst teachers leave, well, someone needs to replace them, ideally with not another 5% at the bottom, but someone who's really good. And in fact, we can have the full set of teachers being drawn from high quality, motivated teachers as they are, and then also provide them the resources to continue investing and I think that's exactly what we need to do.
So a number of studies about merit-based pay suggest that would be an appropriate way to get the best and the brightest to enter the teaching profession. As far as burnout goes, that's, I think, a more complicated issue, and I think there will be some people who will say, I've had it after 5 or 6 or 7 years, and those who say, this is my life's love and I'm going to continue to do it.
Well, I mean, we have the highest pupil per teacher ratios in the country, and so part of the burnout comes with the high workloads that teachers face. And in some areas that are really well funded, it's not only that their classes are smaller, but they have 2 periods a day or whatever to have development, right? And so that doesn't happen here as much. And so that all contributes to workload and burnout. And so this is an issue of funding.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. Please join me in thanking these 2 great panelists.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, Wes.
I'm sorry we couldn't get all to the questions tonight, but if you do have questions you'd like to have addressed, you can find me on the UCLA Economics website, drop me an email, and I'll do my best to respond to your interests and questions. And please vote on November 6th, and thank you very much for coming tonight.